Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Estela Perspective. My name is Ernesto Estela, and this is a show all about politics, anthropology, culture in the 21st century and beyond. Today, we have a very special episode. Welcome, everyone, in. We have a very special episode today that will concern everything related to space colonization and the future of humanity, as well as some specific critiques that I want to talk about. But I hope you guys are all doing phenomenal, doing super well. I know I am. It was a good day here in Washington, D.C., where we are streaming from, and the date is July 31st. It's our last day of July. The month, the year is going by really quickly, but today was the last day of the year, and it's also our 30th episode, so quite a lot of episodes now. But this is the 30th one. And how's it going, Octavian? I see you there in the chat. Hope you're having a wonderful day. But indeed, today's episode is going to relate to space colonization and the future of humanity, and a variety of different topics like that. Also related to civilization and kind of the Kardashev scale and some other kind of ideas. It's going to be less of an organized episode. I just kind of want to ramble about some of these things. Just take it a little easier because these past couple of days we've been going like really long, so just want to take it a little bit easier, but I think it's going to be a good episode. And I also kind of want to rant about two Twitter posts that I saw. They're unrelated to the matter of space and the future and all of that, but for the most part. But I still kind of want to rant about them because it's passion and it kind of pisses me off. So that's why I want to talk about them. But yeah, I mean, in essence, the main topics that I want to touch upon are the future of human civilization, the future of humanity, and the world as we know it, frankly. And this is in reference to civilization. We've talked a lot about the demographic collapse. We've talked a lot about automation, and there will be a little bit of that. But ultimately, I kind of want to explore the ideas of the future. And I guess the way I'll start this, just to get right on into it, is, I think that and here's going to be kind of just a random jump into the conversation, but something that I dislike, a notion about space colonization that I dislike, is the notion that humanity is going to unify into one planetary government, into one world government, and then we're going to go colonize the space. I think that's flawed. I think that ultimately what's going to happen, and obviously there's different things that matter and different variables into that, variables related to our own internal state and whether or not we self-destruct and so on, and we're going to touch upon that as well. But I think that ultimately the way that space colonization is going to play out, and really this is something that's going to start developing in likely the latter half of this century and maybe even the 22nd century. That's when it's going to likely start playing out to a larger extent. I think that the colonization of space and humanity's venture into the cosmos will likely be in a divided fashion. We will still have these nation states on the planet. We will still have these civilizational states on the planet instead of this one large planetary government. I think that to some extent, there likely will be some sort of international law in space. There will be something like that broadly. But ultimately speaking, I think that there will be different political entities and they will be competing for power. And the reason I think that, first of all, it just seems more natural. I think that global unification is something that's going to happen, but I think it's going to happen maybe, I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. I think it's going to be the case in maybe, unless something really dramatic happens, like a world war, something like that really kind of shifts our horizons in this natural trajectory that we're on, I think it'll happen maybe like in 200 years or something like that. I'm just taking a guess. This episode is going to be largely speculation, but that's kind of my idea of it. And I think that ultimately, until then, humanity will set up territory in different planets, in different celestial bodies like Mars, like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and they will be colonized by different civilizations. And mainly, and frankly, here's something else that a lot of people don't understand. Some people believe, like me, that it will be nation states and civilizational states that will colonize the cosmos, at least initially, right? But something that a lot of people don't understand, especially people kind of from the developing world, is that not every country is going to take part in this process. Not every country is going to be actively involved. It's really only going to be a handful of countries, maybe like 2, 3, maybe it can go up to 10. But frankly, it'll just mostly be like a couple of large powers, because a country like Bolivia, a country like Paraguay, a country like Cameroon isn't going to have its own space colonies. Like, that's ridiculous. Bolivia isn't going to have its own space colonies. Hell, I mean, South Korea probably isn't going to have their own either. I mean, countries with a space presence will likely be limited to very few. And I'm not going to outright, predict which ones they are, because, the world is going to change dramatically by then. But just broadly speaking, there will likely be a North American kind of polarity, a North American state projecting itself cosmically or astronomically. I don't know. There would be probably a European one, a Chinese one, maybe Japan, maybe, and something, maybe India. We'll see what will happen. But the notion that every country is going to be, participating, and it's going to be, that's not how it's going to play out. It's really going to be just a handful of very powerful countries, the countries that can afford space colonization, the countries that have the infrastructure for it. Those are the countries that are going to be involved. And I'll read your comment in a second, but what I'll say is, and this kind of relates to what I'm talking about now. It's a little like the European colonization of the Americans and the world. Because, people say like, oh, Europe colonized the world. And it certainly did. But it wasn't really Europe. It was like 5 European countries, or it was like 4 main European countries. Like, of the European countries, the ones that really had a lasting impact at the colonial level and spread their language and spread European civilization, I mean, we're really talking of Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, and Russia. That's the extent of it. I don't think that you can even count Italy. I don't think that you can even count maybe a little bit Germany, but very little. I mean, Germany was very much a continental empire. It was really English. That's why we're speaking English, right? It's because the English were the ones that were most successful in this, and they conquered North America. They conquered the majority or a large part of Africa. They conquered India, and they made themselves their empire. Similarly, it will only be the countries that can afford this capital, that can afford this technology, and that have the vision and the stability and longevity that will be able to guide the future direction of humanity. And let me read this comment here, and then I'm going to continue because I've got something interesting to say as well. Octavian says, I'm certain that our borders will change, but I doubt the peoples of different civilizations will want to be under one planetary government. I think that generally, I think that too as well. I don't think that we're going to have global unification anytime soon. Reason I say that eventually there will be global unification, and the reason I believe this, I mean, there's many reasons, certainly, but I think that ultimately there is a process of homogenization that is going on right now. Obviously that, there's kind of waves of this. It's kind of like an alternating pattern. We go from a more homogenized world, a more unified, centralized global system, like with globalization, and then we have a period of fragmentation, like we're moving into now, like multipolarity and destabilization. So we're going into this bottom period, and then it'll go back up, and it'll be kind of like this, just broadly speaking. But as a whole, I think the trajectory tends to go towards centralization, and the reason that's the case is because of technology. I mean, there's other factors as well, but ultimately, when you have technology, I mean, you and I are both communicating, and you're in a completely different state, and well, you and I are in the same country, but you could be in Britain and it would be the same. You could be in Singapore, you could be in Brazil, and we'd still be communicating. So that closeness that technology brings about is a unifying force, is a unifying factor. That is why I think that ultimately there will be a process of global civilizational unification. And that's only in realms of communication. We can talk about transportation and how you can take a flight to France in 7 hours, how you can how our goods are produced here and they're shipped over this way, how there is a global interconnectedness. So I think that will ultimately, like in the process of a nation, that will ultimately produce a globally unified state, a globally unified empire. I'm talking in the long term, though. This isn't a principled matter. And Octavian says, if various humans ever do colonize the stars, something that should be accounted for will be the demographic winter and the encounter of extraterrestrials. Yeah, I mean, that's true. I think that, unless you mean something else, when it comes to the demographic collapse that we're going to experience soon, the demographic winter, I think that we will have already transcended that. I think that in this century, I think we're going to certainly expand our presence in space. We will likely get a manned mission to Mars in this century, and we will likely get a lot of space mining, like asteroid mining operations. I think that's going to happen because, there's a lot of valuable resources and metals on those. I don't think we're going to get large-scale colonization, though, not in this century. I don't think we're going to be able to live that. I think that maybe, the people that come, the people that are born when we die, like so in 100 years or something, in 80 years, I think they will actually explore this new frontier, and they will start, they will be the first to explore this new frontier in some way. They will start terraforming Mars. They will start building bases in Europa and in Titan and in Venus. That will be kind of the first wave of expansion, but that will already be past the demographic wave, past the demographic winter, the demographic collapse. That will be in a different state. I mean, that's too far to predict. It's too far. I'm just kind of predicting these ideas more so in principle, but yeah, I mean, by then there will be totally different conditions, and the modes in which people reproduce, and the culture that structures people, and the spiritualities, the forms of government, and the philosophies that order people's lives will be drastically different from what we have now, and likely. As I've said before, civilization by that point will likely be more mechanical than human, or will largely be mechanical. So that is kind of something to say. But I wanted to say, and here is something that I believe, and this is a little less so about space, but you'll see how I connect it here. And this is something I believe about geopolitics and civilization as a whole, broadly speaking. And this is one of the arguments that I think you can make for hegemony. One of the arguments that you can make for imperialism, something that I've thought about as well. Think of it this way. I mean, if you take from the premise that eventually there will be a unified human civilization, or at least there will be a unified planetary civilization, which I think is a natural process, I think is naturally going to happen, then it's important from the perspective of you as an American, or of you as a Chinese, or of you as a European, or whatever. It is important from your perspective to argue for hegemony, and specifically for cultural hegemony, for the cultural hegemony of your state over the world. It is in your interest to argue that. Why? Because ultimately, this planetary culture that will be produced, and that is slowly being produced, will be a blend of different cultures. Like America is a blend, like even Europe and Rome and these different civilizations, and India are blends of different cultures and civilizations. The culture that dominates, the culture that ends up being the most powerful one, is the one that essentially kind of, let's say, takes the most. Let's say, if I'm trying to express myself. So essentially, if we have American cultural hegemony, that guarantees in one way or another, that in 200 years, that globally unified planetary civilization will be American-like. It will be kind of American, So if you think that it is valuable for your culture to be preserved in the long term, you want to make sure that your current culture has hegemony, so it shapes the future. And you know what I do think, and I'll look at your question in a second, but this is something I think. I obviously can't guarantee this, and the things that we're going to live through in the next couple of decades are going to change things drastically. That's for sure, or have the chance to change, have the ability to change things drastically. But I think that the future of civilization, human civilizations, at least on the trajectory that we're currently on, is kind of an American, and by that I mean like Anglo-American-esque civilization. Because sure, every culture of the world and every language and every form of food and dress and spirituality will have its impact. But ultimately, the lingua franca that is being spoken is English, and nothing is going to supplant that. I mean, there's already billions of people, or at least like 1 or 2 billion people that learned English specifically for this process, specifically for the purpose of communication. There's already so many people using the dollar. There's already so many people looking up to the United States that have, and maybe they don't consciously agree with it, but subconsciously, they wear blue jeans, they speak English, they use Instagram, they post with hashtags, they act like these Americanized people, because as we talked about before, this global empire that we exist under, this global Anglo-American hegemony, is promoting a process of Americanization. They promote movies, people watch movies, kids in Africa grow up watching Mickey Mouse and SpongeBob, so they are all being homogenized in this sense. So from the perspective of someone that would want American cultural hegemony, the future of civilization to be like America, then you would prefer to want American cultural hegemony now. That's what I mean. And this kind of relates to what we were talking about yesterday a little bit, but I said that China didn't really have the ability to become hegemon because, it certainly does if it really tries. It certainly does. But as things stand right now, no one speaks Chinese apart from the Chinese themselves. No one speaks Chinese, and as things stand right now, in China they've got their own versions of rap, and in China they wear Michael Jordan jerseys and stuff like that. Some people certainly. So they are under this process as well. They certainly aren't exporting their culture like we are. So if China wants to, if China wants its civilization, the legacy of its civilization to be carried on into the stars, and I mean that in a true kind of grand sense, because obviously, even through this American civilization, it will be preserved, right? Like the Amerindian civilizations were preserved under the Hispanic Empire, under Hispanic civilization, because they were. There was this kind of translatio imperii, right, under the Spanish crown, in some capacity, assuming that this Anglo-American hegemony continues to go on forever or go on for many decades or maybe a couple of centuries, then these civilizations like China, these civilizations like India, sooner or later will start speaking English. Sooner or later, they will be assimilated, because sure, they're very mighty, and they stand the test of time, and they're very ancient. But if eventually, little by little, they are more integrated into the economic processes, more integrated into the governmental processes of the world, which will happen, will progressively happen, as is already happening. We're living in a wave of fragmentation, but eventually that wave will resume and will reunify. Assuming that we continue to live under Anglo-American hegemony, those civilizations, eventually the whole planet will speak English. That is just simply the case. I mean, unless the alternative would be that we are, the Anglo-Americans are defeated, and then that maybe Chinese culture is imposed. But I'm just speaking of the current trajectory. And At the Exchange says, hello, how's it going, my friend? Let me just read this comment by Octavian here. He says, I think the advent civilizations that I'm aware of are probably going to colonize the stars, but I think it will be quite different from how I imagine it, or we imagine it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I think you're referring, like, the advent civilizations are the ones that are going to come after the demographic winter and the demographic collapse. And what I like to call, a term that I kind of came up with. I mean, probably someone has used it before, but the crisis of the 21st century, because you've got the crisis of the 3rd century, and you've got the plagues that attacked the Roman Empire and the barbarian invasions. I think that we are going to live through a crisis of the 21st century. And what's another term that I used, and this is something else? The lost century. I think that in some way, the 21st century might be considered the lost century of humanity. I'm not saying this is guaranteed, but if the things that we have talked about in previous episodes manifest to the extent that we have hinted at them potentially going, I think that this could be like a kind of a century of humiliation for the entire planet. You know what I mean? If we really take a tough hit. So that's kind of an idea. And that could certainly bring about new civilizations. We're going to see where that's going to develop. But those are some of the questions that we're going to talk about today. And let me just read this question here. Local guy on the internet says, I saw some sub 90 IQ post on I saw some sub 90 IQ post a picture of a Chinese city on Twitter with a bunch of bright LED lights on it and on the building, and claim that China is years ahead of the US. Bright lights equal future. I agree with you. I kind of agree with you that sometimes those posts are very misleading, and people do exaggerate. I will say though, technologically speaking and in terms of development, I think that China is a ways ahead of the United States in terms of development. Obviously, they have a lot of poverty. Don't get me wrong. There's still, I've heard that even in China, there are a lot of slums, or even slums that can be compared even to the favelas, and you see these buildings, these buildings in Guangzhou and these different cities, and living in them is miserable. So the idea that China is living in the future, it's certainly not. China has a lot to brag about, has a lot to boast about. It can talk about its metro systems, the highways that it's built, the abundance of housing. That's certainly all true. But ultimately, the United States is still, I would say, is still ahead of China, broadly speaking. But certainly they have a lot of admirable stuff, specifically in their coastal cities, and those are things that we should try to replicate. Those are the things that we should try to copy, and they should try to expand throughout their entire nation, and the whole planet should implement as well. But that is kind of ultimately what I think, what I was talking about, this process of global unification. And something I'll say too is I think that the UN, not necessarily the UN itself, but there will eventually be a process of governance, a unification of governance. And I'll read your comment in a second, Dead Shooter, but I think there will eventually be a process of global governance as well, and unification, where there will be one common authority. And the way that that's probably going to play out, I don't think that one country is going to conquer the rest or something like that. I don't think that's going to happen. But the way that I kind of expect that's going to happen at some point is like, You're going to have we talked about these string of cosmopolitan cities. You're going to have these cosmopolitan cities here and those here. You're going to have Tokyo, London, New York, Buenos Aires, these different cosmopolitan cities around the world. And they're going to, and just as we've seen with liberalism in the past 30 years and even before that, they're going to pursue trade policies, they're going to pursue common security policies, and there will be likely one or two major kind of patrons of this empire, perhaps the United States and the European Union or something like that, and eventually there will be a process of global federalization. But I'm talking way in the future, don't misunderstand me. But let me just read these comments here real quick. So Dead Shooter says, I think that the biggest disadvantage for China is their fertility rates. I genuinely think that the USA will still be the hegemonic power for that alone, if not exclusively for that alone. We've talked about this before. I don't think that the U.S. will likely remain the hegemonic power, at least. I think it will certainly lose its hegemony temporarily. It might regain it later. But that is certainly true, that the demographic collapse is going to hit China very brutally. We've actually made an entire video on that. We've talked about this almost every day, about the demographic collapse in China and in the world, frankly. But there are some solutions to that. There are some ways around that, which are mainly around automation. And specifically, China can address those issues because they've got a lot of robotics. They can produce a lot of robots. So that we talked about that a little bit yesterday and the day before yesterday too. But that's something important to consider for sure. Local guy on the internet says, different civilization. We can't be like them. We are more individualist. I think that's the case too. Certainly not right now. But in the future, we've already seen that as civilizations spread and as systems of power and trade and commerce and movement and communication spread, people end up homogenizing traits. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, a person in London today has so much in common with a person in Singapore, and they're in different points of the world, and they both speak English, they both maybe work in finance, they both live in cosmopolitan lives, they move around the world, they're kind of these digital nomads in some capacity, these finance nomads, you know what I mean? So there is, what you're saying is true, that there are these cultural differences, but there is a process of global unification that is going on in one way or another. Even if in the last couple of years we've seen it decline, eventually, maybe in 30 years, maybe in 50 years, we don't know, eventually it's going to pick back up. And eventually this process will resume, maybe not under the authority of the U.S., maybe under some different authority. We don't know. Dead Shooter says, without the old one kid policy, maybe things would be different. I actually don't think that. I think that China's demographic collapse is largely inevitable. I think that the one child policy did make it worse. It certainly did. But I don't think maybe they lost one decade by doing that, maybe even a couple of years. But ultimately, it was going to happen. And you look at these other countries like South Korea, like Japan, these other East Asian countries that developed rapidly. They didn't have one-child policies, yet they're in the same boat, if not worse, right? So they're just as fucked. I think it's very much something related to their culture and to the speed at which they industrialized. That's something I've talked about before. Let me just read these two comments, and then I'll resume. Octavian says, the civilizations I know of are Salarian, Indo-Hispanic, and Anglo, and Eurasian, Slavo-Turkic, and Mandalian, Indo-Malaysia, and Southeast Asia. I suspect these guys will traverse the stars. Maybe. We're yet to see. I don't know. I'm not thoroughly convinced by those. I think there's some truth to what you speak of, though. I think there is some truth, specifically the Arado-American stuff. I think there's some truth to that. But, I don't know. We're going to see where it's going to develop. And then Octavian says, most countries are going to be hit with a demographic winter brutally, except for Central Asia, Africa, and the Andes. Even those regions are also going to be hit. I think maybe the one that might be able to escape it a little bit might be Central Africa, but Central Asia has largely been able to, evade the large demographic collapse so far. But if you look at their numbers, they're still declining. So they're certainly doing better than Poland. They're certainly doing better than the US and then China and then India. But they're actually still declining. I think the fertility rate in Kazakhstan is 2.3, and replacement level is 2.1, 2.2. So they're really not doing that much better. They're going to, go down that same route. Everyone is. And even the Andes, you look at Bolivia, you look at Peru. I think Bolivia might be an exception, but you look at Peru and, these countries among the Latin American states are the ones that have the highest fertility rate, but they're still collapsing. Hell, even in Africa, even the West African, Central African states, they're also going down. And I think that, ultimately, what I think is every time the United Nations makes predictions for what the world population is going to be and when it's going to peak, initially it was believed that by 2100, we still would not have peaked. That by 2100, the population would still be gradually increasing and then it would peak. Now, I'm pretty sure the prediction is like 2075. I wouldn't be surprised. You know what? I wouldn't be surprised if the global population peaks by 2050. I would not be surprised because we just don't have the numbers for it. Like, genuinely, people are not having kids. And I think I talked about this before, but I thought that Colombia's fertility rate was 1.6 or 1.7 or 1.8. I don't remember, because that's what some sources say. But you know what other sources reveal? They say that it is 1. That the fertility rate of Colombia is 1.05. So that's terrible. And that is a country, a Latin American country that is not at all developed. And if it's so bad, if it's so low, that sets a really bad precedent. And other countries are headed in the same direction. So I don't think any region is really going to be able to escape this unless we talk about these other ideas of spiritual revival and so on. That likely is going to happen, religious revival, but in a later day. We are going to have a big initial hit. Let me just take a sip of water here, but I kind of want to return to the topic of space here. And you know what? Something else. Let me see here. Yeah, I very much do also believe in this kind of Kardashev scale. You obviously know what it is, but I'm just going to give you guys a graph here. And you obviously know what it is, but it's just so interesting, and I like to understand it. But here, let me just present my screen. This is obviously the Kardashev scale, and it is just a metric that uses energy, the consumption, or I think it's the production. No, it's the consumption of energy. It uses the consumption of energy to classify 3 different stages of civilizational development, of objective civilizational development, of objective modernization, and it has 3 types. So it's got type 1, type 2, type 3, and some people have even gone to theorize up to type 7. I think that's just fan fiction and so on. But really there's 3 or 4 types, and this is on a logarithmic scale. So this is 10 to the 16th, this is 10 to the 26th, and 10 to the 36th. And essentially, a civilization that is a type 1 civilization is one that controls, or rather, one that is able to control or harness. It is able to harness all of the energy resources produced by its native planet, by its home planet, in this case, the Earth. We're not even close to that. We're not even remotely close to that yet. A type 2 civilization is able to do that for its entire solar system, and a type 3 civilization is able to do that for the entire galaxy in which they reside. But, humanity as it stands, I'm pretty sure we're at 0.7. And remember that this is actually a logarithmic scale. So it is a logarithmic, us being at type 0.7 doesn't mean that we're like, oh, we're only 0.3 away from type 1. I mean, I guess we are, but that's logarithmic. So in reality, we actually have to increase our energy capacity by like 1,000 times. Because think about it. I mean, sure, we harness a lot of energy, but what percentage of the planet's energy output are we actually harnessing? Are we harnessing all of the energy generated by all of the waves? Are we harnessing the energy from fucking volcanoes and geothermal chambers? Are we harnessing the oil? And I'm not saying that would be necessarily the case, but we're nowhere even close. And that's just type 1. And then we have to move on to type 2 and type 3. Obviously, and I'll say this, obviously, that by the time we achieve type 1, because this is just kind of a broad classification, by the time we achieve type 1, we will likely already have a multiplanetary civilization. We will likely already be in different locations throughout the world. It's just that we won't have yet harnessed the entire energy of one planet, because 10 to the 16 watts is an incredible amount. It is just so much. So likely this kind of objective will only be met once we have already ventured far outside of the planet. So that is certainly something. And by the time we do this, I mean, we're going to be in probably hundreds to maybe even thousands of planets. I'll say hundreds of planets, and so on. So this is something I do believe in. It's the Kardashev scale, and the way in which it kind of relates to objective development, because obviously that's something that I frequently like to talk about here, are objective forms of development and how society progresses and can be measured objectively. And I think that energy is actually quite a good one. We were talking about this, I think 2 days ago. We were talking about a Newtonian understanding of politics, and that's something I really like, because I like to emphasize objective development. And when it comes to that, there is kind of these Newtonian frameworks that you can use in politics. In politics, you can talk about energy, the energy of a candidate. You can talk about kind of potential and these different kind of scientific terms. One of the ways to measure civilization is through energy, because energy, whether we, whatever we think, I mean, energy is certainly one of the fundamental units, one of the fundamental currencies of the universe is energy. Some people, I think, have even, I think I've talked about this before, but some people have even talked about the potential use of energy as a form of currency. I think those are the technocrats. The technocracy movement has talked about that, and that's certainly something that's interesting to consider. But I think the reason I like to emphasize energy here is because I think that a civilization on the other side of the planet, not the planet, on the other side of the universe, on the other side of the galaxy, let's say, probably has a system of classification similar to this, because this seems like this is like understanding the hydrogen atom, okay? Maybe not that level, but this is like understanding how nuclear reactions work. It is a fundamental framework to understand the world. I guess it's not necessarily real because, like atoms are actually real and manipulable, but this is a framework that seems objective. You know what this is like? This is like understanding logarithmic math, This is like understanding geometry, because sure, it's a framework that you come up with, but reality is kind of conducive to that being the case. It's like the development of politics. So this is kind of an objective framework of development. And let me just read this comment here by Octavian. He says, knowing the nature and the history of humanity, I genuinely doubt people will unite as one civilization. I disagree. And I don't think it's really like people uniting. I think it's more like systems uniting. I think it's more like an empire will eventually homogenize control. And again, I don't think that empire, it's going to be like traditional conquest, but I think that one system will eventually homogenize control over the planet, because that's just the natural progression of society. You can talk about these kind of Spenglerian sort of like cyclical understandings of history, but that's not really what I believe in. I mean, we can obviously debate that, but I believe in this. I believe in a linear progression of society. Obviously, that it's got circular and kind of rhythmic patterns to it, where there are processes of destruction and decay and then rebirth. But ultimately, with enough time, I think that there is advancement, and advancement eventually implies the entire colonization of the world. And you want me to give you a good example as to why I think this pattern is true, is factual, is because if the entirety of history had been like kind of, I think you're painting it, then that would be something. But already from what we've seen of history, already from what we've seen of the past 12,000 years of humanity, we know that civilization, the scope of civilization, the geographical scope of civilization has expanded. Back in the day, back 5,000 years ago, there were several civilizations. You had Egyptian civilization, perhaps Minoan civilization, Chinese civilization, Mesoamerican civilization. But these were small points on the map. Large parts, the vast majority of Earth was what we could consider uncivilized. Everything that was Scythia, everything that was the large parts of North America, the Amazon, certainly most of sub-Saharan Africa, all of Siberia, most of Europe, all of those regions were uncivilized, and that's why you had the Greeks go out there and set up their colonies, and in these kind of Greek city-states, they kind of fought off the barbarians, or that's what the Romans did eventually, and civilization ever since that point has been a gradual process of expansion. It has gradually been a process of expansion, pushing out these barbarians or civilizing them, acculturating these barbarians, and eventually we arrive at the point today where essentially the entire surface of the planet, I would say, is kind of, quasi-civilized. Maybe not all of it is at the same level. That's certainly the case. But ultimately, certainly North America is more civilized than Central Africa. Certainly China is more civilized than Siberia. It's got a bigger human presence, a bigger technological presence, a more developed culture too, if that's the way you want to frame it. But ultimately, there will be a time where one civilization will, just by the nature of civilization and the advancement of technology and economic systems themselves, there will have to be one civilization that homogenizes control over the rest. It doesn't have to be necessarily conquest. It doesn't have to be necessarily subordination. But eventually, by the same technological systems that we are communicating right now, there will have to be an integration, and there kind of already is being one. Once again, we're living in a wave of that wave of being undermined, but ultimately that's going to happen. And Alexandre Bonaparte, that's a nice name, by the way. It's really probably not your real name, of course, but that's still a cool name. Says, money is what's holding us back from that. Money is what holding us from that. You mean the presence of money? I disagree. I disagree with that. I think that, maybe you're putting that as like a socialist critique, a critique from socialism towards capitalism. I think that maybe that will be the case. And, I am someone that I'm a capitalist, but in the long term, in 100, 200 years, I think that we will most certainly outmode capitalism, and certainly capitalism will be overcome. But yeah, I don't think that that's what money is holding us back. As a matter of fact, you know what I think? I think that capital and money and capital power is often a tool of civilization. I think that it oftentimes is good, because think about it this way. It's like when you have capital from, I don't know, say American capital in a country, right? Or not, you don't even have to take it that far. I mean, when you have a country like Brazil, for example, and you have a wealthy person from Rio de Janeiro, a wealthy person from Sao Paulo with a lot of capital, millions of dollars, they go into a random plot of land in Mato Grosso, they go into a random plot of land in some other part of the country, they invest, and that capital is kind of energy. We're talking about energy. That capital is kind of like economic and social energy, So with that capital is that buildings are built, is that societies flourish, is that new buildings come to life. And that's why money is actually good in some capacity. Obviously, the greed is bad, and obviously the money needs to be regulated well, but in some way, capital can be understood as currency, credits of civilization in some capacity. And I think that's even a Marxian understanding in some way. But let me read this comment by Octavian. He says, civilizations do colonize barbarians, those who are foreign of someone's civilization, but that is natural for humanity. Yeah, that is natural for humanity. You know what I will dispute with you, though? I don't dispute this, but just I'll say it's not only that civilizations colonize those that are foreign to someone's civilization, because, the way that you're presenting it seems a little like a subjectivistic interpretation of civilization. And we've talked about this before on the show, I think once before, but there's kind of two ways of looking at civilization, the subjective way and the objective way. I think that ultimately the objective way is correct. So when I say like barbarians, I don't think that barbarians are really like a subjective thing, they are barbarians to my civilization because they're foreigners. No, I think that they are barbarians because they are objectively less civilized. Of course that, from a human point of view, of course that there is that subjectivity, and ultimately I think that both frameworks are compatible, but fundamentally I do think that there is such a thing as kind of objective barbarism. I think that is the thing. Not to say that the universe deem this is objective barbarism, or these people are objectively barbarians, but when I say a barbarian and a civilized person, or not even a person, a barbarian society and a civilized society, I'm using it in the framework of like this society is objectively more, like, you want me to give you an example? Let's look at this. Like, say that there existed a galactic empire, a truly galactic spanning civilization with millions of developed planets and a truly colossal thing, a truly galactic civilization. And within, one certain arm of the Milky Way, within one certain arm of the galaxy, there were these people that lived on one planet, and they were only a type 1 civilization. At best. Maybe they weren't even type 1. Maybe they were like us. And they were, shooting rockets into the major cities here, and they were fighting wars in here. From the perspective of these type 3 civilizations, these type 1 people, these type 1 societies would be barbarian societies. They would be objectively less developed. You know what I mean? So you could talk about morality and what they think, and maybe for these ones, these would be like imperialists or whatever, but ultimately these are less civilized people. They are at a lesser stage of objective human anthropological development is kind of what I'm trying to stress. But yeah, what else do I want to say? There's a couple of things else. Some people talk about the Kardashev scale going even further. You know what I've heard too, and let me try and look for this up. Let me try and look for this. Here we go, because this is something interesting too. Okay, yeah, because this is one that not a lot of people talk about, but let me try and show you something pretty interesting. I think this one does the job. I can't remember exactly what this is called, but the Kardashev scale obviously focuses on bigness. It focuses on scale, on scale upwards, on bigness, but on the scale and magnitude of logarithmic magnitude of energy consumption. But this is another scale. I don't know what this is called exactly, but there's another scale that has been used, which is kind of an inverted Kardashev scale. And what it argues is that civilization can best be measured not by the scale that it reaches, but by its ability to interact with smaller and smaller things. So that's also something interesting. A less developed civilization, a very rudimentary civilization, might be able to interact with some things that are a couple of millimeters wide, like ants and so on. But a more advanced one that recognizes medicine, is starting to interact with red blood cells and with bacteria and so on. And then a more advanced one invents, antiviral devices, and then a bigger one splits the atom, and then another one interacts with photons, and then quarks, and then the universe can create black holes and shit. I don't know, I'm making something up, but this is another kind of interesting kind of framework. I don't know if this specific graph refers to that, but this is also kind of an interesting framework. I do ultimately resonate more with this here, with the Kardashev scale. But this is something interesting, and I think there's also truth to that. And you know what I wanted to say? And this is kind of something that relates to, I think, something maybe Jack Jones. Yeah, Jack Jones said this a couple of streams ago, and this I kind of do understand. It's the idea that, ultimately, if you go into the atoms, if you go into the subatomic particles, like the smallest possible things, like quarks and so on, ultimately, those are kind of universes in and of themselves. I kind of do think there is some truth to that. That's certainly not fully understandable, but I think the notion, here's what I'll say. We exist in the observable universe, right, as a society, and as a civilization, as observers. And what the observable universe means is, people think that, and let me just pull up a photo here. Let me pull up a photo of this. Just so I can kind of show. Here we go. People think that the observable universe is just kind of the entire universe. I guess people that don't know that much, but that's not the case. Observable universe is just the universe that we can observe, because obviously light, for us to observe something, light needs to be in proximity with our eyes. The light from those faraway stars needs to have arrived at our view, because the universe was created at some point. We have a lot of evidence for that, but the universe has expanded faster than the speed of light, and the universe has expanded faster than the amount of time it takes for light to reach us. So as far as we know, maybe the universe is infinite in scale. I don't think that's the case. There's evidence to dispute that, but there certainly is an observable universe, and we can't see all of the universe. That's certainly true. There are certainly stars out here, and we are just waiting. We are just waiting billions of years for light to arrive to our eyes so we can perceive it. So that's something, right? That is the concept of the observable universe, and there's certainly truth to that. But you know what I also think is the case? Why isn't there such a concept of an observable universe in terms of scale as well? Because we are here, and we can, and the smallest thing that we can recognize, I think, is a Planck length, I think the smallest identifiable kind of distance is called a Planck length. How is that Planck length not actually just essentially the horizon of what we know? I think it is. I think that there is smaller things, and at the same time, I think that there's bigger things too, because, this is kind of the biggest thing that we can see, the biggest thing we can understand is the observable universe. But who is to say that our technology is not sufficiently advanced? And this is something related to one stream that I said, and I'll read you guys' comments in a second. This is something related to one stream that I said, something I said on stream one time, that the universe is far greater than we think. That the universe, we think that we have figured everything out. We think that, we know the biggest scale of the universe. We know the smallest things. What else is there left to do? And maybe they don't say that, but that's ultimately kind of the attitude that they're approaching the world with. That's an attitude that I very deeply reject. The attitude that I take is that, like the Kardashev scale, we are only at the beginning of civilizational trajectory. And sure, we already know what the observable universe is, but those horizons are so much more complicated than we think. What if all of the observable universe is just in one atom and we can leave that atom? How do we know? How do we not know that? How do we not know that there is something bigger? I think there is. And I think, the Greeks, for example, the Romans, any civilization before ours, essentially, any group of people before ours, they knew the stars and so on, but they didn't know about the observable universe. They didn't know about these different galaxies and so on. No, they had no idea. They hadn't even imagined such a thing. In the same way, we haven't even begun to imagine the things that are out there, or the things that are in here, the things that can go deeper. So that is kind of what I'm trying to stress. The Greeks, the way that the Greeks thought, many of them, and the classical civilization, they thought that the stars made the world, the earth was in the center of the universe, and there was a sphere of stars, a kind of an astral sphere of stars around the universe. That's broadly how they viewed it, but obviously that wasn't the case. Obviously it was much bigger, and we weren't at the center of it, right? So that's something. And let me just read these comments here, and then I'll resume. Alexandra Bonaparte says, "You were talking about energy. What do you think our civilization relying a finite resource like petroleum?" I think you're okay. Yeah. What do I think about our civilization relying on a finite resource? I think that I think that petroleum certainly isn't going to be the future. That's certainly the case, and by that I mean in this century. In this century, petroleum will largely be phased out. Not entirely, but largely will be phased out. But it's not even a matter of petroleum being finite. That's something that people talk about, and it's not really relevant. People say like, oh, one day we're going to run out of oil. That's not the problem. There's so much oil. If you go up to Canada, if you go to Texas, if you go to Brazil, if you go to Russia, there's more than enough oil we would ever need. The problem is that the oil is destroying the environment. That's the problem. So it's not really about it being finite. It's about the harm that it's doing to our environment. You know what I will say to that, though? You know what I will say to energy? Nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is just the way to go. Obviously, investing in solar, investing in these other things too, but nuclear energy is the way to go. And you want me to show you something interesting too? I'm sure that a lot of you guys know this as well, but let me just show you something interesting. This is what is talked about when it comes to how we will solve the problem of energy at the galactic and interstellar scale. It's called this. This is called a Dyson sphere, and this is I'm sure you guys all know this, but this is it proposed technology for harnessing the entire energy of the sun. So essentially, like you've got, and here's some other pictures, but essentially you've got the star, the planet, the sun, and then around the sun, you build a system of solar panels and of ways of harnessing and mirrors and ways of harnessing the energy from the sun. And then you have, trillions, quintillions of gigawatts of energy. You've got so much energy, enough energy to colonize the planets and to do whatever you want. That's what people propose. But until then, this is, I think that we will eventually build this. But I think that something like this will probably happen I don't know, I'm going to make up a number. I don't know, like in 10,000 years. Like I think it's something like this is possible in 10,000 years. Before then, I don't really think it's possible. Maybe like 5,000, I don't know. But seems difficult. Maybe less, who knows. But eventually, here on the planet, we're going to use nuclear energy because as far as I'm aware, that's essentially unlimited. Nuclear energy is essentially unlimited. And Octavian says, when I'm talking about a barbarian, I use it in the classical sense, like a people group outside of the civilization during its grand phase. Okay, I mean, I think that falls in line with my definition as well. You say like how the high Greco-Romans described the lowly Germanics. Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately falls in line with what I'm saying is again. So yeah, I think I agree. And the philosopher says, "Hi there, how's it going, philosopher? How's your day been, my friend?" And let me just resume here. And that's something I'll say. So I think that the scale to which we have to expand is much bigger. And, I will say something just before I get into kind of the interstellar colonization side of things. I've talked about spirituality before. I've talked about spirituality and how I think that there is ultimately an intersection between the soul and matter, how there is an intersection between maybe not divinity, but between the spiritual world and these cosmic forces and nature. I think that there is such an intersection. I don't think that they're necessarily separate. I don't know if they're different essences. I don't know how substances. I don't know how you would describe it, but ultimately, I think that an advanced enough civilization will be able to manipulate things like soul. I think that a advanced enough civilization will be able to manipulate things like maybe even the nature of things. And by that, I mean even like the nature of physics, the nature of reality, and even the nature of logic. That's something I've thought about. Like if you have a sufficiently advanced civilization, and I'm thinking, way ahead here, but who's to say that we couldn't bend reality and we couldn't bend the universe in such a way where 1 + 1 isn't 2? Who is to say that we can't do that? And it might seem impossible to understand now, but I mean, it was impossible a couple of decades ago not a couple of decades ago, but it was impossible a couple of centuries ago to believe that we could create a sun. We could create a sun, and here we are dropping nuclear bombs and so on, right? So, these things that are outside of our scope may very well be possible in the future. We don't know. And, I have little reason to believe that we have approximated the limits of what's possible in humanity in the world. I think that there is so much more to go that we don't even comprehend. And I'll say something else here when it comes to this kind of limit of upper development. When it comes to like AI, and here's something I'll say, because let me kind of show you this singularity theory. I think you'd call it singularity AI here. Let me show you something. And I've talked about this sort of stuff before. Here we go. This is kind of what I need. I've talked about this sort of stuff before. But this is like one of these theories that I talk about, like grand civilizational development, grand kind of sophistication, cultural, human, grand sophistication. I mean, this is obviously just like this graph was made by someone. You can literally see the spelling mistakes and everything here, the capitalization. But in any case, this illustrates the point. Like, if you draw a logarithmic kind of graph, you will see that a lot of the developments that we have seen as a civilization and even as a force in the universe, as a force of consciousness in the universe, including the animals and going as far back as unicellular life, you can see it kind of graphed on here. I'm not saying this is perfect, and I'm sure there's many flaws here, but this is logarithmic. So this is time before present, and this is 10 billion years. So 10 billion years ago, 13 billion years ago is when the universe was created, as far as we know. 10 billion years ago, nothing had happened. But 4 billion years ago, life did begin on Earth. 4 billion years ago, the planet started. I think it was 3 or 2 billion years ago that life begun. But yeah, then you get eukaryotic cells, multicellular, the Cambrian explosion, mammalia, because this is logarithmic here. Obviously, this is more and more time is compressing. But then you get the genus Homo erectus, spoken language emerges, specialized stone tools, and then Homo sapiens, here we are, and then, this is already 10,000 years, and this is already much shorter here. You get early cities, agriculture, the advent of the city-state, electricity, telephones, personal computers, and the question is, and because this is largely true, I mean, there is an acceleration of inventions that is going on, and not just inventions, but if you go back here, there is an acceleration of sophistication. The question is, what's going to happen when we get over here? Because, this is still several years. This is still several months. Back here is several decades, hundreds of years, thousands of years, billions of years right back here. But over here, I mean, between the computer, say, the personal computer, say, I don't know when this graph was made, but the personal computer, say that it was made, I don't know, 20 years ago, let's just say 25 years ago or 30 years ago, like the laptop or something, like 30 years ago. Now we have AI. What's going to happen when the inventions get too quick? What's going to happen when the inventions get too quick? What people call that, they call it the countdown to singularity. They call it singularity because that is kind of the convergence point. That is the point where everything is kind of happening at once. All of the inventions are happening like in one instant. I don't know what's going to happen. A lot of AI nerds and a lot of AI people talk about this sort of thing. But ultimately what I think is going to happen, I don't know. I mean, I can't really judge, but there's several theses, several hypotheses. One is that civilization just self-destructs, which is possible. It is possible, and maybe that explains why we don't see any life on the planet, on the universe, and we're going to talk about that in a second. That's the Fermi paradox. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we don't see life in the universe, is because maybe once you reach such a level of development, and maybe we're only a couple years away, there is an inherent self-destruction of society. And why does that happen? We don't know. I mean, the Fermi paradox, that's what the Fermi paradox says. The Fermi paradox talks about great filters. So the Fermi paradox talks about, you've got these different civilizations that are emerging, and they all encounter these great filters that get increasingly harder to surpass. So, one great filter is like the development of the development of nuclear weapons. It's a great filter because a lot of societies develop nuclear weapons, end up destroying themselves and annihilating themselves in nuclear war. So it filters out a lot of civilizations. Another great filter is the development of biological weapons. Another great filter is AI. I don't know. There's many potential great filters, but maybe you could make the case that the singularity is kind of the last filter. We've made it a long way here. Maybe I'm just proposing something, and the singularity will be the filter to end all filters because of the inherent structure of the universe. Whenever computers get sufficiently advanced, because of a purely mathematical law of the universe, they lead themselves to self-destruct. They conclude, because of a rational process of argumentation, hypothetically, they conclude to self-destruct. I don't know. I'm just making something up, but that's a possibility. I don't think that's going to happen. But that still raises the question then, what's going to happen when we get to the singularity? Maybe some would say that it's impossible to reach. Maybe some would say that once we arrive here, we just start stagnating. Maybe some would say that once we reach the singularity, and this is kind of what the people that I critique would say, maybe those people would say that once we reach the singularity, we continue advancing at a rapid rate, not advancing, we continue, existing and thriving, but we just, can't advance anymore because we've effectively invented everything, and, we can't travel faster than the speed of light, and there's not much more that we can do, so we just got to gradually expand at that slow scale. I don't think that's the case. Either. And I've got kind of my own hypothesis, and my hypothesis of what happens when we reach the singularity, or maybe not the singularity, but what happens when we reach this critical point, this critical moment, what happens when we advance enough, when we advance so much. I don't necessarily think there is such a thing as advancing enough, but once we truly advance to this rate, let's just say once we reach the singularity, I think that we will start to look into other horizons, for example. Again, I've talked about art. I've talked about how automation and AI will replace human jobs, and they already certainly have, but they will continue to do this, and humans will have to resort to other things because eventually, not saying now, but eventually we will likely reach a post-scarcity world because we will have space colonization and so many different, resources, and maybe we don't have all the francium that we need here, but we'll find it in asteroids, and eventually we'll colonize the stars and find it elsewhere. Eventually, we will kind of have a post-scarcity world. I think that by then, we will begin to look into different frontiers because, the very idea of a post-scarcity world was beyond the scope of what medieval people thought, was beyond the scope of even what Enlightenment or maybe even classical people thought, for the most part. I'll give you an example of what I think could happen. I talk about spirituality. I talk about art. I think that in one way or another, we are going to, start to open up technological dimensions into spirituality and into art. Like, how can we manipulate the soul? How can we interact with these millions of versions of myself? How can we manipulate time? That's the sorts of things that I think we're going to deal with. I obviously have no way to back this up, but just given the trajectory of history, given the trajectory and the potential of technology, I still think we're very far away. I think that this whole singularity, I don't know. I don't know, I can't make that much of a claim about it, but I think that ultimately we will begin to interact with dimensions and with finding out about a multiverse, finding out about some sort of spiritual enlightenment within, that the soul actually has a dimension and the goodness is actually a measurable thing, mathematically measurable thing, and that goodness is actually correlated to fucking how often you smile. I'm just making something up, but you know what's something I think, and this is something I actually think, and this is this is kind of maybe schizophrenic, like pseudoscientific or whatever, but this is something I kind of do flirt with. It's the idea that there are a lot of things that right now we don't seem to be able to observe but that are real. And let me give you an example. Let me try and think of an example. It's tough. It's tough to think of an example. But what I'm trying to say is how do we know, there's things today that we point to and say those are just coincidences, those are things that just happen, or maybe that we don't even notice those patterns, right? For example, I just opened the door. Every time I leave my room, I open the door. When I open the door and I exit, and you might say, oh, that's just a product of the fact that, he chose to do that at that time. That's just he does it at different times, because I don't always open the door at the same time. Obviously, maybe there's just no coincidence. He's just opening the door because that's just the case, right? He's just going to go to sleep or whatever. That's just the case. How do we know that I am not always opening the door whenever the 3 moons of Saturn are aligned or whatever? I'm not saying it's that simple. I'm not saying that's the case, obviously, but how do we know that there are not indicators to dictate everything else in the universe? How do we know that every time I open the door, there aren't twins being born in China? That's just an example once again. But how do we know that? How do we know that these things that seem arbitrary aren't actually observable? And I'm putting it kind of in an understandable sense, in a kind of empirical sense. And obviously, it would be empirical. I'm putting it in kind of a material sense. But how do we not know that every time my soul is inverted is when I actually choose to fucking go to the gym? That's just an example, but that sort of thing. You know what I mean? Those sorts of parallels intrigue me, because why do we assume that we have all the answers already? How come these sorts of things aren't possible? And those sorts of things, those were just some lame examples, but those sorts of parallels that don't seem possible to us right now are, I think, what we are going to begin to experiment with once we reach the singularity, or once we become sufficiently advanced. Once it might seem like we have advanced as much as we can, those are the doors that we're going to start opening. I mean, those doors will open there will never be a point. I don't think there will ever be a point where civilization will say, there's nothing left to do. We've advanced enough. I don't think that point will ever happen. The only conceivable point for that to happen is apotheosis, is theosis, is becoming God. I think that, and I've talked about this before. I think that ultimately society, I don't even know if society, I don't know how you would characterize it, but I think that the process of development, the process of civilization, is ultimately a process of theosis, where the subject, the civilization, the culture, the individual, maybe all individuals combine into one, maybe they combine into one supercomputer, I don't fucking know, one consciousness, eventually becomes God. I kind of think that's the case, or maybe reunites with God. I don't know, but something like that, I think, is the case. Let me just read these comments here. Octavian says, I have interesting views on what I think extraterrestrial life will be like whenever various peoples actually encounter them. That's interesting, yeah. And you say, I plan to write a Substack article about it at some point. You definitely should. And we can talk a little bit about that too, about extraterrestrial life. And Alexandre Bonaparte says, do you think time exists? I don't know. I think the time is, I don't know. I mean, I've heard not theories. I mean, I've heard people say that the time is an illusion, and that ultimately time is just another kind of not spatial dimension, but it's just another dimension. It's just another. It is kind of a spatial dimension. That's just how we understand it, because we are kind of stuck within time. You know what movie I really like? Arrival. And I think that movie, and let me just show you kind of I mean, a lot of you probably know this movie. It's actually one of my favorite movies. But this movie, I think, relates to kind of what you're saying, well, the question that you're asking, and it relates also to what I'm pointing to. This idea that we've got it figured out. We haven't got it figured out. And let me just show you the screen here. If you haven't watched this movie, you should watch this movie. It's so good. This movie is about these spaceships that land on Earth. It was made in 2016 or something. It's about these spaceships that land on Earth, and I don't want to spoil the whole thing, but essentially They have, okay, I'm just gonna spoil. I'm not gonna spoil it, but I'm gonna give away a little bit of the concept because I just need to be able to talk about it. But in this movie, essentially, there's these aliens that come to Earth, and I'm not gonna talk specifically about what happens, but they have a language. They have a unique language, and it's essentially this language over here. Here you can see it. They've got this weird kind of system, this weird writing system. Which is like the universal language. And these are these super advanced aliens, and they say that they're here to give us a tool, and we don't know if it's a weapon, we don't know if it's a language, we don't know what it is. But one of the main characters learns the language, and she's the only person to ever learn the language, or the first person to learn it. And because she learns this unique language, you know what happens? She gains the ability to look into the future and the past. And that's something that's so interesting. And I think, you know what? I think that it could be true. I think that it could be true. I don't know if humans have the ability for that, but I think that a computer maybe will be able to do that at some point. I think that is certainly something that might be able to happen, because I don't know. I mean, I feel like a computer might be able to. I'm talking about these patterns, right? These patterns that to us seem esoteric. These patterns that to us seem like difficult. But for a computer, maybe that's more understandable. For a computer, maybe it is able to process all of that data. A supercomputer, maybe. And that's why I often talk about computers transcending humanity and AI and automation transcending humanity. It's because, well, yeah, because they're going to be more advanced than us. It doesn't mean that we're going to be replaced necessarily. And ultimately, as I've said before, we would kind of be translatio imperii or translatio especie into the mechanical civilization, translatio civilizatio or whatever the fuck, right? But I think that would kind of happen, and I think that's possible. And I'll look at your comments in a second here, but I think that's possible. And one of the reasons I think it is because linguists and anthropologists talk a lot about language and the implications that it has on our brain, and it certainly has massive things. You know, I think that language to a large extent can be understood as a coding system for the mind. Obviously that, you know, there is other things like, you know, your environmental, psychological, even personal and genetic predispositions. Like if you're an anxious person, if you we get aroused because we lived for the purpose of reproduction, among other things, you know, that sort of thing. But language is a coding kind of framework that affects how you think. You know, something I've heard. I'm pretty sure this is true. I think it's some Polynesian societies, some societies in Polynesia. They don't have a word for north, south, east, and west. They don't have a system of cardinal directions. So I'm pretty sure they always just say left and right. That's all they have. Well, equivalent words for left and right. So whenever they are at any point, you know, they might be just looking anywhere. No. Okay, sorry, I was mistaken. Okay, let me reframe it. Rather, they don't have words for right and left. So they don't have words for those for right and left, but they have words for north, south, east, and west. So here's the thing. At any given moment, whenever they're talking about anything, they say, "Oh, that's your western hand." Oh yes, if you look at the eastern car over there, they're referring to right or left. Not in the same sense. It's just because they think about that all the time. Because their language has no words for right or left. Their brain is coded to always be understanding of these cardinal directions, so they always know where east and west is. Not that they always know. Of course, if you put them in a room and you spin them around, they'll probably get confused, obviously. But they always are kind of thinking about it. They're always kind of aware of it. You know what I mean? So maybe that's not that insightful, but I do think that ultimately, I'm not saying this is possible, but in theory and principle, I think that the human mind can be drastically manipulated if taught different concepts. And that's part of my constructivism. But let me read a couple of these comments here. So Alexandre Bonaparte says, I think we live just in two dimensions, energy and movement. That's complicated. I don't know. But I guess movement, I guess maybe energy and a spatial dimension or a set of spatial dimensions. Maybe that's what you're getting at. And Google Eye Enjoyer. Okay, Arrival is a great film. I know, right? It's so good. One of my favorite films. And Alexandre says, I think if we move energy into the past, we go in the past. If we move energy into the future, we move into the future. Energy could be the sun or wherever. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but maybe I think that sort of idea, those sorts of ideas are kind of the future. And when I say the future, I'm not talking about like the next 20 years. I'm talking in the real far future. Those sorts of ideas will become more true than we think. These ideas of I don't know of I don't know. It's complicated. I will talk about something esoteric in a second. Let me just answer to this last comment here. Alexandre Bonaparte says, language should be images. I've thought about that too. I don't know. I mean, maybe in the far future. I think that text is very useful, though. I think the text, the textual form is very useful. But you know what I'll say? And by the way, Emperor Bonaparte is based. But I just wanted to say that. But, you know, I want to say... and this is pretty schizophrenic, I'll admit. And there's actually a term for this. Let me look for the specific term that I'm looking for, because this is an idea that I have entertained. I think it's called, here, let me just look, because I've got this reading list, and this is like some weird shit, and I think it's considered a form of schizophrenia, but I've read some Substack articles, some very weird Substack articles, and if you're someone that, has, here it is, it's called apophenia. And let me kind of show you what it is. But if you're someone that pays attention to a lot of details and narrativizes a lot of things, I narrativize a lot of my life. I narrativize a lot of things around me and say, that's happening for that reason. I'm feeling this way for this reason, and this is happening and that's happening, and I am in this arc of development, and this is going to happen in the future. If you kind of deal with those ideas, and if you play very close attention, I think that you do end up picking on some weird patterns. Am I saying that I can read the future? No, of course not. But I think that there are weird things that happen, and I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to make a crazy claim or anything, because I think in some way it is apophenia, and apophenia is kind of this mentally diagnosed thing. Not to say that I have any condition or anything like that, but in any case, there's just things that happen around you all the time that seem indescribable. Things that even seem oftentimes to defy linear time. They seem to defy the linear movement of time, and make you wonder, like, why are those things happening, and make you think about the spiritual relations of the world, make you think that there is something more. Matter is not the only thing, that if we really think outside of the box, there's other potential explanations. Like, once again, maybe every time I decide to go to sleep early, that's because the moon rose on the north and landed on the south, maybe stuff like, what I mean, that sort of thing. But it happens on a personal level. But let me just kind of project my screen here. And this is called apophenia. And this says, apophenia is the tendency to perceive the meaningful connections between unrelated things. The term was coined by psychiatrist Klaus Conrad in his 1958 publication on the beginning stages of schizophrenia. He defined it as an unmotivated seeing of connections accompanied by a specific feeling of abnormal meaningfulness. He described the early stages of delusional thought, as self-referential overinterpretations of actual sensory perceptions as opposed to hallucinations. And it says, Apophenia has also come to describe a human propensity to unreasonably seek definite patterns and random information, such as occur in gambling. So this is kind of the weird stuff that I'm referring to. And I can link you to some interesting Substack articles, that will make you say, like, what the fuck? Like, this is literally what I think about. Like, so it's very weird. But I think that ultimately, call me crazy, I think that ultimately these sorts of relations tend to be true in some way. Obviously, that there's certainly elements of delusion, and certainly there's subjective interpretation and narcissism. 100% this is happening too. But I think that there are some interesting things that happen like that. Some things that really are defying our empirical understanding of the world. And Alexandre Bonaparte says, I do that too. It's like I explain it my way, and it does make sense 100% to me. 100%. It's very weird. It's just very weird. But I don't know. I mean, I guess there's not that much point in discussing it, because ultimately we can't prove it. We're gonna have to wait until technology advances until we can really make something out of it, in that sense. But let me just look here at what else we can talk about. I guess while we're kind of on the subject of in the subject of these multiplanetary civilizations, I kind of want to talk about the dark forest hypothesis, and this is something that I know was like trending on TikTok some time ago, trending on the internet like a couple of months ago or maybe a year ago. These different civilizations, these different hypotheses, like the Fermi paradox, as to why there aren't, why we aren't able to detect civilization in space, because the universe is massive and it has existed. It has existed for 13 billion years. We would expect some other civilization to have emerged, right? Unless it's self-destructed. Well, the dark forest hypothesis is really interesting because what it says is that there are many civilizations out there just as advanced as ours, maybe even more, some less as well, but maybe even more. And the reason that they aren't giving themselves away is because the universe is an inherently hostile environment. And what I mean by that is that every civilization, we've got the Milky Way galaxy, which with millions, maybe billions of planets. And at least in the Milky Way galaxy, let's say that at least there are 10,000 civilizations. I'm making up a number, but let's say that there's at least 10,000 civilizations, intelligent, developed, complex civilizations, complex societies. Maybe they're all like us. Maybe they're all looking out. But none of them wants to be seen. And why does no one want to be seen? Because it is the threat of annihilation. Because it's a little bit like kind of the fog of war. It's a little bit like a security dilemma in some capacity. That's why I like it, because it's kind of got a geopolitical twist to it. Because maybe civilizations are always threatened by one another. So, if you detect if we are an advanced civilization, maybe let's say we are a type 2 civilization. So we have our control over our entire solar system and we're pretty advanced. And we detect another type 2 civilization. Maybe we get scared of them. So our initial reaction is just to fucking send a photon, not a photon, what would you call it? A gamma ray. We would blow up another. We would artificially destroy another star and send a gamma ray burst towards their star system to annihilate them. Why? Because we are scared of them doing it to us. So maybe the dark forest hypothesis is true. Maybe it's this idea that civilizations are hiding from each other because they fear being annihilated, and that is really kind of scary. Something else that I thought of, and I thought about this today, and I'll look at your comment in a sec. You said I'm giving you content, good stuff. Yeah, you are. Yeah, definitely. You should subscribe. So you can give me more content more frequently. But I'm messing with you. But although you should. But what was I saying? The dark forest hypothesis. Fuck, I forgot what I was going to say. No, I didn't. Hold on. Oh, here we go. Okay, the dark forest hypothesis. So you got all these different civilizations. So say that, here's one. So maybe you've got, in the entire, so the system is made of these kind of, the universe, as far as we know, is made of these galaxy clusters. And let me kind of show you these galaxy clusters. And as far as we know, I'm pretty sure, these different clusters of galaxy are, insofar as the speed of light is the fastest that you can travel, which so far seems to be the case. I don't think it is, but so far seems to be the case. Then these galaxy clusters that contain a couple hundred galaxies are the furthest that we can ever visit. And why is that? Because assuming that we can't go faster than the speed of light, the speed at which these galaxy clusters are spreading from one another is already, or will soon be, I think it already is, faster than the speed of light. So, we are in this galaxy cluster here. We might send a rocket going at 99.99999% the speed of light, because we can't go the speed of light, but that's a different thing. We send the rocket going up, but because it is expanding quicker than the speed of light, it will actually never get there. This might still be going extremely fast, but this is going further away. So we will never be able to leave our galactic cluster, at least insofar as the speed of light is the fastest that you can travel. And what that means is that we are contained to a neighborhood of galaxies. We are contained to the Milky Way galaxy. In our system, there are two big galaxies. There is the Milky Way galaxy, which is ours, and there's an even bigger one, Andromeda galaxy, and they're actually on a collision course. If I'm not mistaken, they're going to collide is it in 2.5 billion years that they're going to collide, or is it in 2.5 million years? No, it's certainly not million, right? Let me see. When will Andromeda and Milky Way collide? Okay, 4.5 billion years. So we still got a time to go in 4.5 billion years. But kind of what I kind of wanted to say is, maybe in this galactic cluster here, and there's also some smaller galaxies, but the two big ones are Andromeda and Milky Way. Maybe within this galactic cluster here, there is an ongoing race, because you can't really interact with anyone outside of your galactic cluster. So within these, there is an ongoing race between, I don't know, 200,000 advanced civilizations, and some will be wiped out by great filters, some will be annihilated by others, and so on. But imagine that a very big one emerges in Andromeda, a type 3 civilization, or a type 2, type 3 civilization emerges in Andromeda, and it is trying to monopolize power. Maybe it becomes extremely developed. Maybe it becomes a type 3 civilization. Maybe it is even trying to become a type 4 civilization, whatever that means. If they detect an ant, for example, if they detect an ant on another planet, if they detect any semblance of a threat, maybe they just decide to annihilate it, because they say, you know what, we'd rather, you got the super advanced civilization, and they see humanity over there, we're venturing out, we're colonizing Mars, we're developing fusion energy, whatever, and they say, we would rather annihilate them now than wait 100,000 years or 1 million years for them to be as big to rival us. So maybe they rationally choose to just annihilate us. We have no reason to believe that these alien civilizations are going to operate under the same ethical paradigms as we are. Maybe even it will be us. Maybe even it will be us that will be annihilating them. The way that I kind of think about it is like, maybe it's like the kid that is just destroying anthills. The kid that sees an anthill and his immediate reaction is just to destroy it. That was kind of me when I was young. I feel like that was almost everyone. Everyone kind of got some pleasure from destroying the anthills. Maybe that was just me, probably not. But in any case, that's kind of what I think about it, and I think that's very likely. Not very likely, but I think that's certainly a possibility to entertain, is that kind of dark forest hypothesis in this specific case. What's another idea? I think that and I'll kind of wrap this up quick, and then we'll move on to some other parts of the stream. Another idea is maybe humanity will be the first one. Maybe humanity will be the first one, the most advanced. And this idea that we will have how we have like North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is where you have those kind of indigenous Indians in India, that they are like this uncontacted tribe, this uncontacted tribe of people that, whenever anyone goes there, they shoot arrows and they're like protected. They're like protected. Maybe we right now are in that position. Maybe there is a large kind of spacefaring civilization, a confederation of spacefaring civilizations. We don't know. And maybe we are like this indigenous group that is being preserved because we are so like, they want to see how we develop. So we're kind of like a little experiment in some way. Or maybe we are going to do that to them, because we do that already to animals, we do that to people too. We do that to these people too. So maybe we're going to encounter life on Europa. Maybe we're going to encounter life on a different solar system. Maybe we're going to do that to them. Maybe we're going to turn them into a national park or a galactic, an interstellar park or whatever, So who knows what's going to happen. And I think I'll leave that at that. Let me see what else there's to talk about. I talked about this. I talked about... Okay, I'll talk about two quick things here real quick. The first one is just that it is imperative for our species to become multiplanetary. And what do I mean by that? Not for our species, I guess for our civilization, yeah. It's imperative, it is a necessity that our species become multiplanetary, because that's how you safeguard your civilization from being annihilated. Not from everything, but we are here on Earth, and if a meteor like the one that hit the dinosaur were to fall on us right now, we would be like annihilated. I'm sure that maybe some elements of society would survive. Some people hidden in bunkers, some people in the International Space Station would survive, but 99.99% of humanity would be wiped out, and we would be sent back thousands of years. Potentially, we would go extinct. I think that we'd likely go extinct there would be no food. You couldn't grow any food. And the people in the International Space Station, I mean, eventually they need to come down and eventually they need to refuel, right? So they can stay in orbit. So that's just not gonna that's just not a viable strategy. So you need at least 2 planets. You need at least this one here and a secondary planet in Mars or in Europa or whatever. So if we lose one, we have another sustainable habitat to exist in. That's what I mean. Obviously, a gamma ray burst. If a gamma ray burst fired off and fried our entire solar system, we would just be cooked. But then that's the reason not for a multiplanetary species. That's the reason for a interstellar species, for a multi-solar species. So that's kind of the idea. And then the final idea I will say is I don't think that the speed of light is the quickest that you can go. I think that faster than light travel will be developed. I don't think it's going to be like faster than light, because light is the top speed of the universe, because I'm pretty sure that's the speed at which atoms interact with one another. So even if you hypothetically could have something that could go even faster than light, which isn't an achievable speed, hypothetically, I'm pretty sure it just wouldn't even work from a physical point of view, because it would just break down. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is, I think that faster than speed of light technology will probably be seen in the sense of warp, of kind of black holes or something. I don't know. I think it'll something be related to that, related to dark matter, and that's what's really going to allow us to colonize the stars. Because I mean, if it is the speed of light, the fastest that you can go, then that's really a shame. And I don't think that's the case, but that would really be a shame, because even reaching our closest star system, Proxima Centauri, would take 4 years at the speed of light. Now imagine at our technology, it would take decades, it would take centuries to reach it. So even if we develop something going at 20% the speed of light, which is already crazy, it would take 20 years to get there. So that seems just, it's not good. And to go from one side of the Milky Way to the other takes 200,000 years. So at the speed of light. So I don't think that's going to be the limit. And let me just read this one here by Alexandre. She says, I think before the Big Bang, 2 black holes merged into one insane point of energy boom. Everything started. I don't know. I've heard things about, like, I think I've heard things about entropy before, and I've heard things about like heat death, and after the heat death, how eventually there is, what they talk about? They talk about quantum tunneling. Maybe that's related to what you're talking about. They talk about quantum tunneling, and that like a piece of matter or some form of energy came back from the past or maybe the future, I don't know, and restarted the universe. I don't know what happens. I ultimately think that God created it, but I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. God probably didn't, like, I don't know. It's complicated. I don't want to get into the whole debate, but you say maybe one fixed point everything comes back from and goes to. Yeah, I mean, other people also talk about this, and let me kind of this is called the big it's called the Big Crunch. Maybe you've heard of this before. Here we go. This is an interesting theory. But let me show you this theory. Okay, I think this one will illustrate it pretty well. Maybe this relates to what you're talking about, but this is the Big Crunch theory. And there's obviously many theories. There's a Big Bang and so on, but the Big Crunch theory says that the universe expands and it expands and it expands, and then at some point, for some reason, I don't remember why, time reverses, and then all time begins to flow backwards. So everything that I'm doing here, I would start doing it backwards. And then the Big Bang, so it is like it opens up and it closes and it opens up and it closes. There's different physics justifications for all of this sort of stuff. I don't know them, but I don't know. This stuff is all crazy. I don't know. I don't think this is the case. And you know what? I would really hate if this were the case. If the universe were just a cycle of expansion and closing, and time repeating and inverting and repeating and inverting infinite times. So we have lived it. I have done this infinite amounts of times. God, I hope that's not the case. Because that's just so boring. That's just so boring. What's an interesting concept that I like? Let me give you guys an interesting concept. This is called, What's it called? Is it this? I think it's this one. Yes, here we go. This is an interesting one. I have a little bit of this. And let me give you this. This is called Welt. This is called Weltschmerz. Weltschmerz. I don't know how to pronounce that well, but this is called Weltschmerz. It's called literally world pain. Is a literary concept describing the feeling that by an individual who believes that reality can never satisfy the expectations of the mind, resulting in a mood of wariness, sadness about life arising from an acute awareness of evil and suffering. I at least in the sense that I understand this is like, because here's the thing is, sometimes I think about these fantasy universes. I come up with these stories. I come up with these stories in my head, with these ideas, with these romanticisms, these romantic stories, these political narratives, all of these different stories. And I say, like, that's so cool, but that's never going to happen. Like, it's just never going to happen. Not because it's necessarily impossible. It's never going to happen because it's just not going to happen, because the universe is not big enough. You know what I mean? Like, there is a limited universe. So, well, at least from what we know, I would say probably not. I don't know. But this is kind of sad, because I imagine all of these potential worlds. Think about so many possibilities. That aren't going to happen. That's kind of sad. But then in the inverse, there's also some interesting things. You know what's something that a lot of people don't really understand? If the universe is infinite, right? Assuming that the universe is truly infinite, beyond the observable universe or whatever, assuming that there is truly an infinite universe, or maybe an infinite amount, or maybe a limited universe, but an infinite amount of time with different possibilities every time, that means that absolutely everything is going to happen. And assuming that the world, let's just assume for the sake of simplicity that the universe is infinite in size. That means that everything is going to happen at every moment in time. That means that in another planet, trillions upon quintillions of light years away, there is another Ernesto Estela giving this exact presentation, giving this exact show, interacting with another Alexandre Bonaparte in a platform also called YouTube, in a completely disconnected planet. That is also happening. Isn't that crazy? And that's also happening. And you know what's also crazy is that assuming that the universe is infinite, that means also that not only is that happening on another planet right now, that means that there is some planet where that is happening. And, there is an Ernesto Estela in his apartment doing it. And right next to him, in another apartment, is another Ernesto Estela, and they are not aware of each other, because everything that can happen is going to happen. You know what I mean? So it's just crazy. But I sometimes kind of think that also might be the case. I don't know. I'm just theorizing. I'm just flirting with these ideas, but I guess that's better than just nothing happening. I guess that's just better than just one possibility happening. So this is kind of one of the reasons why I reject the Abrahamic stories. I'm a theist. I believe in God. I believe that God works in very mysterious ways. But one of the reasons why I reject the Abrahamic mythos, and why I reject a lot of the stuff related to Revelation, not entirely, but a lot of the stuff related to Revelation, is because, I don't know, it just seems a little too, for one, it seems a little too convenient that specifically the Son of God came to our planet in this timeline. It seems a little odd, because God is something that is not so close to us. Maybe we are close to God, but I don't think that God is particularly close to us. I think that God is this massive entity that is not even bigger than the universe. He is bigger than all of the universes combined. God is the biggest thing that there is, in my opinion. That is something I can say for sure. God is truly, I can't say that the observable universe is the biggest thing. I can't even say that a multiverse of multiverses is the biggest thing, but I can say for a fact that God is the biggest thing that there is. I can say that for a fact. So God is infinite, correct? Alexandra says God equals infinite possibilities. I agree. So God truly is infinite. So that is kind of the scale that we're dealing with here. It is just infinity. So that is what's crazy. That's what's truly, truly crazy. And let me see what else we can talk about here. yeah, I think we've largely covered everything. I think we might leave it at that. There were two other things that I kind of wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about maybe a little bit about Marxism and a critique I had, and also about the Roman Empire. But I think I'll leave that for a different episode because, I mean, I think that this kind of concludes the topic pretty well. And, it's been an hour and a half. I think this is a good time to leave it at. With that being said, yeah, I mean, it was a great episode. We talked about all sorts of things. And I want to appreciate you guys for watching. I want to appreciate you as well for participating. Alexandre Bonaparte. I love Emperor Napoleon, by the way. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of the people I look up to in many ways. Not in every way, but in many ways. Yeah, I want to appreciate you guys for watching, and this is the Estela Perspective. We host this show every weekday from 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to 11 p.m. same time, Eastern Standard Time, Monday through Friday. So tomorrow will be the last show of the week. And yeah, with that being said, we talk about politics, culture, state-of-the-art anthropology, state-of-the-art politics. Just we ramble about these ideas. This was more of a kind of a crazy episode. Normally we talk about more grounded stuff, but I wanted to change it up a little bit. Alexandria says, "Great mind." Yeah, great mind indeed. With that being said, my name is Ernesto Estela, and this is the Estela Perspective. You guys have a good rest of your night.